On the morning of the 10th of October, 1918, the Royal Mail steamer Leinster was torpedoed by the UB-123 in the Irish Sea. The number of those who lost their lives amounts to at least 564, including cablemen. It was written about by W.V. Kerry in the Zodiac, the in-house magazine of the Eastern Telegraph Company. So welcome to another tale from the Zodiac. The following is quoted verbatim. By the time these notes appear, the torpedoing of the RMS Leinster on the morning of October 10th in the rough and swift-running sea, and in sight of the Kesh Rock lighthouse, will have been sufficiently told to have suffered bereavement out of the disaster. But to the general cable service, it still remains a duty to recount that there were 6 cablemen aboard the Leinster on that fateful morning, and that 5 of them lost their lives. Richards, Eastern Union, who was proceeding with Helle and Paul, 2 of the lost ones, ex Valencia, to assume duty at Penzance, is the sole survivor of these 6 young martyrs to duty. Anthony Baker, Anthony Jones, and Ralph Murray, 3 Waterville school learners, all aged 17 years, who had just been appointed probationers and were on their way to take up work in the Commercial Cable Company's office, London, complete the sad total of 5 young souls of the cable worlds hurled into eternity without warning. All 6 youths, on the day preceding the disaster, travelled together from Kerry as far as the Grosvenor Hotel, Dublin, where the want of accommodation, as 3 rooms only had been engaged, necessitated their separating, Richards, Helle and Paul going down to Kingstown and remaining there the night. On the following morning, it is learned, the 3 Waterville boys, rather than risk missing their passages on the Leinster, which they anticipated could not possibly take all who wished to travel by her, left Westland Row Station by a train due out an hour before the boat train. Such is fate. By that same calamitous sailing, 150 people were refused accommodation. But duty is a very real thing to the average cableman, and his personal safety never obtrudes itself where punctuality is concerned. He must be on time. The 2 complete trios of the cable service never met on the boat, whereby nothing is known of Murray from the time he left the hotel, for his remains, together with those of Baker, were not recovered. It is known, however, that he boarded the boat, because a survivor saw him on deck in the company of his 2 schoolfellows just prior to the first explosion. The remaining 4 are accounted for either by Richards or sad and irrefutable dumb evidence. Richards says he was on deck with Helle and Paul, and just under an hour out he felt an attack of seasickness, and not wishing to concern his friends, crossed to the opposite side of the boat, over which he was leaning when the first torpedo struck. Terrifying as the explosion and its results were, the effect on Richards appears to have been simply that of an impelling anxiety for the safety of Helle and Paul, and an irresistible longing for their companionship. He found Paul, who said he had become separated from Helle and did not know what had happened to him. Cautioning Paul not to stir, Richards set out to look for Helle, but met with no success. He then returned to Paul, told him to strip off everything except trousers, and to be sure to put his money and watch in his hip pocket, which he was to button up. It was while they were thus engaged that the second torpedo took effect. Following which, almost simultaneously, the boilers burst, the funnels came crashing down, and the decks of the Leinster, half floating, half submerged, became a concentrated hell of emotional, suffering humanity, whose agonized cries were not the least of what courage and nerves were called upon to endure. Immediately following this terrible sequence of experiences, Baker walked up to Richards, to whom he had extended his hand in farewell, saying, "Goodbye, old man." Richards, still quite calm, no weeping, no complaining. He just accepted the tragedy as it stood, and was resigned to death. Quite unknown to Richards, though, Baker was not a swimmer, and having no lifebelt, knew his chances in such a sea were about equal to those of remaining on the doomed ship. Doubtless also he did not wish Richards and Paul to know he could not swim, believing, and quite properly, that if they were made aware of his difficulty, they would jeopardize their own meagre hope of reaching safety by rendering assistance to him. Baker, then, must have gone down with the Leinster, and in doing so, rather than risk the lives of his friends in securing from them some measure of his own safety, showed that a generous nature and a brave heart are synonymous both in life and in the face of death. Richard and Paul dived off the ship together. Paul, a splendid swimmer, though not in good health at the time, got ahead and reached a lifebuoy, to which he invited Richards, who refused and counselled making for a raft seen in the distance. Paul stuck with the lifebuoy, and that is the last known of him. Richards got to the raft exhausted, but managed to scramble on. The raft, however, overturned, or Richards was swept off it by the tremendous seas running at the time, and when he regained it, he found he had the company of 3 men, one of whom had broken both his legs while in the water. 3 times all 4 were subsequently swept off the raft, and on each desperate occasion, although all were strangers to one another, the cripple was assisted back to the fickle refuge by his companions in distress, and ultimately the 4 were picked up by a motor launch and landed at Kingstown after being an hour and 40 minutes in the water. Richards found his watch had stopped at 9:45 a.m. Jones's remains were discovered at the Dublin morgue, where he lay on the concrete floor, full 6 feet long and well built, pink of cheek, mouth and eyes closed, and full red lips parted in the most triumphant smile, just as though, either immediately before or immediately after death, he had enjoyed the supremest time of his too short life. His jacket was off, head slightly to one side, in the action of side stroke. Apparently he had dived in and was swimming well and strongly for some object of safety when he was struck on the point of the chin by wreckage. No one from Waterville identified him as Anthony Jones, at least not until some days had elapsed and his name had been discovered on the inside of his singlet by the police, during which interval he was always referred to as the beautiful boy of the morgue. Murray, who was another good swimmer and who had had instructions from his father in the event of the ship's safety being endangered and there being little time to get the boats launched, or disorder, to jump in with everything on except overcoat and jacket, as the rest of his clothing would not impede swimming and would keep him warm and assist buoyancy, had seemingly passed these instructions on to Jones and dived with him. He was a cool, collected youngster, generous and therefore brave, and so it is reasonably thought that he, like young Jones, also put his powers to deserving use by making a fight for it and dying like a man. Heller's remains were found at the Kingston morgue, where they had been identified by Mr. J. Dawson Richards, London, who had them conveyed to Penzance, the Western Union Company reimbursing all out payments in this and other expenses incurred in the search for their unfortunate employees. The kindness, patience, and sympathy extended to all inquiries at the offices of the Dublin Steam Packet Company, Dublin, should be gratefully acknowledged. Nothing was trouble to the members of the staff of this company, which itself suffered very serious losses in most efficient officers and men, besides the sinking of one of its best ships. The Dublin Metropolitan Police, too, were called upon to make tremendous efforts, responded well, and with warmth of heart and that charming spontaneity of help and sympathy so particular to the Irish race. To the fond mothers of those youngsters, no words, however tenderly phrased, may hope to assuage their grief, because in the unfortunate and terribly tragic circumstances of the loss to these sorrowing women of their precious beloved sons, the ground on which they mourn is holy ground, their tears sacred tears, and their sighings the dumb but eloquent rhetoric of a just bitterness born of motherhood outraged by wanton killing.